So, as both a feminist and a huge fan of Game of Thrones, both the books and the television show, I think that the show actually doesn't get enough praise from feminists in terms of the really positive things it does for representation of women on the screen, particularly in a medieval setting in which there is often not a very big representation of female characters. For example, if I wanted to cosplay from Lord of the Rings and I wanted to make it screen accurate from the movies, I would have 4 choices, really. I would have Galadriel, Arwen, Éowyn, or fucking Tauriel from The Hobbit, and we're not even going to talk about The Hobbit because that is a whole nother rant. So, when Game of Thrones came lumbering onto the scene, because George R.R. Martin writes really slowly, I was entranced from the beginning and very, very impressed with the number of female characters and the number of different perspectives and different roles within both society and the story that they played. And I think this is really important because it actually serves to both dispel a lot of myths and kind of bring a little bit more reality to the medieval world of, because obviously this is based on the War of the Roses, so it is based in actual medieval historical context. They just added magic and dragons, and the dragons were at the behest of George R.R. Martin's wife, and she did a great job suggesting that, by the way. So all in all, I really, really appreciate the amount of female characters and how well written they are and how diverse they are. Because typically in fantasy archetypes, you get one of 2 female characters. You get the rah, 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 girl power, super strong, kick-ass, masculinized female hero, like Brienne of Tarth, or you get the more damsel in distress, love interest type of character. And while I love the rah, rah, rah girl power characters, and I love women that fight, and I love strong women, it is kind of annoying when that's a lot of the only representation you see, and also when it's very one note and they're portrayed as being that way all the time. It's kind of like one of the things I appreciated about Buffy, was how she was allowed to be girly and feminine and goofy and also strong. And I think there are different ways to portray those characters that would make them a lot more interesting, and I think Game of Thrones does that really successfully in the way that shows like Buffy and Firefly have in the past. I also think they do a really good job of incorporating female storylines and perspective characters. In the books, you read a lot of chapters from Daenerys and Sansa and Catelyn Stark and Arya, and you even read, I think you even read a few from Brienne. And you read some from Asha Greyjoy. There are several other female characters who I think you read through, and you get to see the story through their eyes as well. And so I think having that in the books is a lot of why the characters are so well written and so dynamic in the show. And, you know, sometimes the writing isn't perfect, but when it's good, it really is very good. And I enjoy the range. I enjoy that there are characters like Sansa that really aren't are not fighters, who play the game in other ways, who get by with their wits. I actually, have loved Sansa from the start of both the books and the show, probably because I started reading them when I was a teenage girl, but I know I'm the only person on the planet who has always liked her, but I always enjoyed Sansa, and I always thought that she was really underrated, and that her strength in, facing her captors, who are the people that murdered her family, is, and what she had to do while in their clutches. I thought that was a really interesting story, and I personally always enjoyed the Sansa storylines, even early on in the show. And her character growth, I would argue, has been some of the biggest in terms of who she started out at the beginning and who she is now. And overall, yeah, I fucking love Sansa. So there are a lot of positive things, I think, in the series in terms of representing all of these different aspects, of representing motherhood in different aspects, of representing women in all of these different roles. I think that's fantastic. Some problems with the show. I have some issues with the way the show portrays sexual assault. I think there is a place for sexual assault in this story, and I think it's a very realistic and important one in terms of how often that really did happen it still does happen often in most parts of the world, including basically all Western countries, but it happened in a way that was much more culturally permissible and in a way that was actively weaponized during warfare. and in other situations. So I think that there is a way to portray that could add a kind of gritty realism and an unflinching look at some of the nasty realities of what living in that time would actually look like. But I think that often the show uses it in a really harmful and sensational way. I think the perfect example of this was the Jaime and Cersei rape scene at Joffrey's funeral. In the book, this was not a rape scene, it was a consensual sex scene. Those are two completely different scenarios. And for me, it really tarnished Jaime as a character in the show, and he already had so much to overcome as a character. But having him overcome all that and then making him be a rapist and then never really addressing or engaging with that, just kind of putting that out there, really makes it hard for me to like him as a character. The only way I can kind of get over it is by just pretending that that didn't happen and that it was just bullshit that the writers added for shock value, because it was. So things like that, or the way the show very much centers female nudity in a way that it doesn't focus on male nudity and sexualizes female nudity in almost all circumstances in which it's seen. A lot of what they did with the sand snakes made me want to scream. The Dorne plot in the book is so completely different. The Dorne plot in the book, the goal is to seat Myrcella on the throne. And because of the female line of succession, the Dornish are so much more interesting in the book. The Dornish in the book would never have fucking touched Myrcella. And it's really annoying because Oberyn in the show is like, in Dorne, we don't hurt little girls. And then as revenge, his partner is like, oh, I know what he would want me to do. Hurt this little girl. What the fuck? Yeah, that plot made me so angry because it took away these really vibrant female characters that also were a big departure from the show in terms of being a force for peace, where a lot of other characters are a force for revenge and for fighting. Because basically the War of the Roses was a real war based on a feud between two families that was ongoing, because as the war continued, the feud deepened. So the Martells are an excellent contrast to that, to the Yorks and the Lancasters and the Starks and the Lannisters, by providing that counterpoint where they stopped the cycle of revenge at Oberyn. It was important to the story, and they had a whole lot of other stuff that was really interesting. Dorne on its own could have warranted a look. It was a very well written and interesting part of the books, and I was so disappointed with what they did with the Dornish storyline. And I think the end of the Sand Snake's story in the Queen's Justice, and I guess their capture in the previous episode, really also underscored it. The fact that they were pretty obviously raped and brutalized when they were captured, and the way that it was portrayed in the show, the implication, and the kind of gleeful way that it was revealed was very bothersome to me. And I feel like they really enjoyed killing the sand snakes that they did immediately kill, and that really bothered me as well in just the brutality of it, in terms of making it seem like it was almost punishing them for trying, in a way that I think that kind of, like, I don't know, the brutality with which they had Euron fight them, I feel both added to and detracted from the story, if that makes any sense. I don't want to get too much into it. It's kind of just my personal opinion, but I didn't like that scene. I thought Cersei's revenge was pretty great, but I thought that a lot of the way they were led up to Cersei and things like that, it bothered me. It made me uncomfortable. And I think that there are a number of scenes in Game of Thrones where I found myself feeling uncomfortable. So I definitely wouldn't give it any kind of a gold star. It has its problems, but I do think that there is a lot of good to be seen in it that is often not recognized in the feminist community. And I think that Game of Thrones definitely warrants a second look and a little more analysis. I think you can absolutely like something while still being critical of it. So that's my thoughts on this. Leave your comments and opinions down below, and feel free to nitpick the shit out of it, because I love nitpicky arguments. If you have obscure book facts, I enjoy them, so drop them below. And that's all I have for you for now. Peter saying bitches.